Everyone in the town believed Daniel Carter had died in the war. His funeral was held, his land was stolen, and his wife was forced to leave. But 1 year later, a mysterious stranger rode into town, and when people saw his face, the entire street fell silent. Because the man they had buried was standing right in front of them. Hook line, very short version for intro. A soldier everyone believed was dead returned home, only to discover the sheriff had stolen his land, his life, and the truth. The soldier who came back too late. The war had taken almost everything from Daniel Carter. For 4 long years, Daniel had fought in the brutal battlefields of the Civil War. Smoke, gunfire, and the cries of wounded soldiers had become the soundtrack of his life. Every night he slept under cold skies, clutching the small silver locket his wife Clara had given him the day he left. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of her smiling. It was the only thing that kept him alive. "Come back to me," she had whispered that morning outside their little cabin near Red Willow Creek. Daniel had promised. And Daniel Carter was a man who never broke his promises. But the war had a way of breaking everything else. The final battle had been chaos. Daniel's regiment had been ambushed in a valley surrounded by thick smoke and cannon fire. Horses screamed, men fell, and orders were drowned by explosions. When Daniel was hit by a blast that threw him into the dirt, the world went black. When he woke up days later, he was in a field hospital miles away. The doctor said quietly, "You're lucky to be alive, son." But Daniel didn't feel lucky. Weeks passed before he could walk again. Letters had been sent home telling families who had died, and many names had been written down wrong. Daniel's name was one of them. According to the Army records, Daniel Carter was dead, and back in Texas, everyone believed it. Months later, when Daniel was finally discharged, he began the long journey home. His horse walked slowly along the dusty road toward Sonora, Texas. Every mile filled Daniel with hope. He imagined Clara running toward him when she saw him. He imagined her crying and laughing at the same time. He imagined their cabin, the small garden she loved, the smell of fresh bread in the morning. He had survived hell. Now he was finally going home. The sun was setting when Daniel reached the hill overlooking his land. He stopped his horse. Something felt wrong. The small wooden cabin still stood, but the fence was broken in places. The garden Clara used to care for so lovingly had turned wild. Tall weeds grew everywhere. The place looked abandoned. Daniel's heart started pounding. "No," he whispered. He rode faster. When he reached the front of the cabin, he jumped down and pushed the door open. The inside was empty. No furniture. No blankets. No signs of Clara. Just dust. It felt like walking into a ghost. Daniel stood there silently. His whole world collapsed in that moment. Just as he stepped back outside, he noticed something strange. Smoke. Not from his cabin, but from the woods behind it. Daniel grabbed his rifle and moved carefully toward the trees. Someone was living out there. And whoever it was on his land. As Daniel approached the small clearing near the creek, he saw a tiny shelter built from old boards and cloth. And sitting near a small fire was a young woman. She looked thin, exhausted, and frightened. Her dress was worn and patched in many places, and her long red hair was tied loosely behind her shoulders. She froze the moment she saw Daniel. Her eyes widened in fear. Daniel lowered his rifle slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said calmly. The woman stared at him like she had seen a ghost. Then she whispered something that shocked him. You're Daniel Carter." Daniel's heart skipped. "Yes," he said slowly. "How do you know my name?" The woman looked down at the ground. Then she said quietly, "Because this used to be your home." Daniel felt a strange chill run through his body. "What do you mean, used to be?" The woman hesitated. Tears filled her eyes. And then she said the words that would change everything. "Your wife, she buried you last year." Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "What?" The woman nodded sadly. "Everyone believed you died in the war." Daniel struggled to breathe. "Where is Clara?" The woman looked away. "I don't know," she whispered. "She left months ago." The words hit Daniel like a bullet. His wife had moved on. His home was gone. And now a stranger was living in the woods beside the life he once had. Daniel sat down slowly on a fallen log. For the first time since the war ended, he felt completely lost. After a moment, he looked back at the young woman. "What's your name?" he asked. She wiped her tears. "Abigail," she said softly. "Abigail Thompson." Daniel nodded slowly. Neither of them knew it yet. But this strange meeting in the woods would change both of their lives forever. Because Abigail had secrets, and Daniel Carter's story was far from over. The stranger in the woods. The fire between them crackled softly as the night grew darker. Daniel Carter sat on the fallen log, staring into the flames, trying to understand how the life he had fought so hard to return to had vanished so completely. Across from him, Abigail Thompson sat quietly, her hands wrapped around a small metal cup of water. The firelight danced across her tired face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "So, how long have you been living here?" Abigail hesitated. "About 4 months, she said quietly. Daniel looked toward the abandoned cabin in the distance. "My cabin was empty when you arrived." She nodded. "Yes." The door was open, and most of the furniture was already gone. Daniel felt another weight settle in his chest. Clara hadn't just left, she had taken everything with her. "Why didn't you stay in the cabin?" Daniel asked. Abigail looked uncomfortable. "I didn't think it belonged to me." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "But the woods do." For the first time, Abigail gave a small, sad smile. "I suppose I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere." Daniel studied her more carefully now. Her boots were worn thin, the leather cracked from long travel. Her hands were rough, like someone who had been working hard just to survive. She looked no older than 20. "You're not from around here," Daniel said. "No," Abigail replied. "I came from Kansas." "That's a long way to travel alone." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she poked at the fire with a small stick. "I didn't have much of a choice." Daniel had heard that tone before. It was the voice of someone who had run from something. Or someone. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of coyotes howling across the plains. Daniel stood up slowly. "You shouldn't be sleeping out here," he said. Abigail looked up at him nervously. "I can leave if you want." Daniel shook his head. "That's not what I meant." He looked toward the cabin again. "You can stay there tonight." Her eyes widened. "No, I couldn't." "Why not?" "Because it's your home." Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "Doesn't look like much of a home anymore." Abigail lowered her gaze. Daniel sighed. "Look, I've slept in worse places during the war. Trust me." He gestured toward the small shelter she had built. "This won't keep the rain out when the storms come." Abigail hesitated for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Just for tonight," she said. Daniel picked up a lantern he had left near the path. "Come on." The cabin felt colder inside than Daniel remembered. The empty rooms echoed with every step. Abigail stepped inside carefully, as if she were afraid the place might disappear. Daniel lit the lantern and placed it on the old wooden table that someone had forgotten to take. For a moment, both of them simply looked around. The silence felt heavy. "This place must have been beautiful once," Abigail said softly. Daniel nodded. It was. He remembered Clara laughing while planting flowers outside. He remembered the smell of coffee in the mornings. He remembered the way sunlight used to pour through the windows. Now the place felt like a memory someone had abandoned. Daniel cleared his throat. "There's an old blanket in my saddlebag," he said. "You can use it." Abigail looked surprised. "What about you? I'll sleep in the chair." She shook her head quickly. "No, you won't." Daniel frowned. "And why not?" "Because you own the house," she said. Daniel chuckled quietly. "Well, that's the first good news I've heard all day." Abigail almost smiled. For the first time since meeting her, Daniel noticed something different in her expression. A little warmth. A little life. Maybe she had once been someone who smiled often. Before something had broken that part of her. As they settled in for the night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what she had said earlier. "Your wife buried you last year." The words echoed in his mind. Finally, he spoke again. "Abigail." "Yes. Who told you about my wife?" Abigail shifted uncomfortably. "The people in town." "You went into Sonora." She nodded. "I needed supplies." Daniel leaned forward. "What did they say about Clara?" Abigail looked hesitant. "I don't know if I should." "Please," Daniel said. She sighed. "They said she waited almost a year after the war started." Daniel's heart tightened. She kept asking the post office if there were letters. Daniel looked down at his hands. He had written so many. But the battlefield had swallowed most of them. Abigail continued quietly. "When the army letter arrived saying you had died, she refused to believe it at first." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. But eventually, Abigail said softly, everyone convinced her it was true. Daniel closed his eyes. The war had taken 4 years from him. But a single letter had taken everything else. "What happened after that?" Daniel asked. Abigail's voice grew quieter. "They said she sold the land and left town." Daniel's eyes opened immediately. "Sold the land?" Abigail nodded slowly. "Yes." Daniel stood up suddenly. "That's impossible." "Why?" "Because this land belonged to my father before me. It can't be sold without my signature." Abigail looked confused. "But that's what the people in town said." Daniel walked to the window and stared into the darkness. Something wasn't right. Someone had taken his land. And whoever it was, had done it while everyone believed he was dead. Behind him, Abigail spoke softly. "Daniel, there's something else." Daniel turned around. Her face had gone pale. "What?" She hesitated. Then she whispered something that made his blood run cold. "The man who bought your land still lives in town." Daniel's eyes hardened. "Who is he?" Abigail swallowed nervously. "Sheriff Wallace." The name hit Daniel like thunder. Sheriff Wallace had always been a greedy man. But stealing a dead soldier's land? That was something else entirely. Daniel grabbed his hat and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Abigail asked. "To town." She stood up quickly. "At this hour?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yes." Abigail's voice shook slightly. "Daniel, you don't understand." He turned toward her. "What?" She looked terrified. "Sheriff Wallace isn't just a sheriff anymore." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Abigail took a deep breath. "He owns half the town now." And suddenly, Daniel realized something. Getting his life back wasn't going to be easy. The sheriff who stole a dead man's life. The night air was cold when Daniel Carter stepped outside the cabin. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Somewhere far away, A coyote howled across the dark plains. Behind him, Abigail stood in the doorway. Daniel, wait. He stopped but didn't turn around. You don't understand the kind of man Sheriff Wallace is, she said carefully. Daniel finally looked back at her. I've known Wallace for years. Abigail shook her head slowly. No, you knew him before the war. Daniel's expression hardened. And what's that supposed to mean? Abigail stepped outside, pulling her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. It means things changed while you were gone. Daniel didn't like the sound of that. Explain. Abigail hesitated, choosing her words carefully. When the war started, a lot of men from Sonora left to fight, she said. Farmers, ranchers, store owners. Daniel nodded. Yes, but Sheriff Wallace stayed, she continued. Daniel frowned. Of course he stayed. Someone had to keep the town safe. Abigail looked at him with sad eyes. That's what people thought at first. Daniel crossed his arms. And now, Abigail glanced toward the distant road leading to town. Now people say the town belongs to him. Daniel felt a cold anger building inside his chest. What exactly are you saying? Abigail's voice dropped to almost a whisper. He took land from families whose husbands never came back from the war. Daniel's hands slowly curled into fists. He told widows they owed taxes, or debts, or fines. She looked down at the ground. And when they couldn't pay, he took their property. The silence between them felt heavy. Daniel stared into the darkness toward Sonora. And people just let him. Abigail shook her head. Who could stop him? Daniel's jaw tightened. He's the sheriff. And most of the town council works for him now, she added. Daniel suddenly understood. This wasn't just corruption. It was control. Then why didn't he take this land too? Daniel asked. Abigail hesitated again. That's the strange part. Daniel waited. They say he did buy it. Daniel's eyes narrowed. From who? No one knows, Abigail admitted. But everyone believes the papers are real. Daniel let out a slow breath. Papers can be forged. Abigail nodded. Yes. But in this town, Wallace's word is law. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. The war had taught him many things. But the most important lesson was this. Powerful men rarely gave back what they stole. You had to take it. Daniel turned toward the road again. I'm still going to town. Abigail looked alarmed. Tonight? Yes. That's a bad idea. Daniel gave a faint smile. I've had worse ideas. But Abigail stepped in front of him. Daniel, listen to me. He stopped. Her voice was trembling slightly. If Wallace really believes you're dead, then you have something most people don't. What's that? A chance. Daniel frowned. What kind of chance? Abigail looked him straight in the eyes. A chance to learn the truth before he knows you're alive. Daniel considered that. The war had also taught him something else. Surprise could win battles. Charging in blindly could lose them. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right. Abigail looked relieved. Good. But we go to town tomorrow, Daniel added. Her relief quickly faded. We. Daniel shrugged. You seem to know more about this place than I do now. Abigail gave a small nervous laugh. That's not saying much. Daniel smiled slightly for the first time that night. No, it isn't. They went back inside the cabin. The lantern flickered softly on the table. Abigail sat down again while Daniel leaned against the wall, deep in thought. After a moment, he asked another question. How did you end up here, Abigail? She froze slightly. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, Daniel added. But Abigail slowly looked up. No, it's fair. She stared into the lantern flame. My father died 2 years ago. Daniel listened quietly. He was a farmer, she continued. We had a small place in Kansas. What happened? Drought. Daniel nodded slowly. He had seen what drought could do. It destroyed our crops, Abigail said. Then one day a man came. What kind of man? A banker. Daniel already knew how that story ended. He said we owed money. And you didn't. We did, but not as much as he claimed. Daniel sighed. That sounds familiar. Abigail continued. After my father died, the land was taken. So you left? Yes. Alone. Abigail nodded. I had nowhere else to go. Daniel felt a quiet respect growing inside him. Traveling across states alone as a young woman in those times. That took courage. Or desperation. Sometimes both. Why Texas? Daniel asked. Abigail smiled faintly. I heard people here were kinder. Daniel looked around the empty cabin. Well, you found me. She laughed softly. Yes, I did. And for a brief moment, the heavy sadness between them lifted. But the moment didn't last. A sudden sound came from outside. Hoofbeats. Both of them froze. Daniel moved instantly toward the window and peeked outside. 3 riders were approaching the cabin. Abigail's voice dropped to a whisper. Who is it? Daniel's eyes narrowed. I don't know. The riders stopped near the fence. One of them lit a lantern. The yellow light revealed a badge on his chest. Abigail's face went pale. Daniel. What? That's one of Wallace's deputies. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. What are they doing here? Abigail whispered something that made the situation even worse. They come sometimes, looking for me. Daniel looked at her sharply. Why? Her voice trembled. Because I refused to leave this land. The men outside dismounted their horses. One of them kicked the cabin door. Anybody inside? Another laughed. Doesn't matter. Sheriff Wallace said the land's empty. The third man raised his lantern higher. Let's check anyway. Daniel quietly picked up his rifle. Abigail looked terrified. What are you doing? Daniel's eyes were calm. Protecting my home. The footsteps outside were getting closer. And suddenly, Daniel Carter's war wasn't over yet. The night the gunshots returned. The footsteps outside the cabin grew louder. Wood creaked as one of the men stepped onto the porch. Daniel Carter held his rifle steady, his eyes locked on the door. For a moment, everything felt exactly like the battlefield again. The waiting, the silence, the danger. Abigail stood frozen beside the table, her face pale with fear. Daniel, she whispered. He raised a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. Outside, one of the deputies rattled the door handle. It's locked, the man said. Another voice laughed. Then kick it open. Abigail's heart nearly stopped. But before the man could break the door down, Daniel spoke loudly from inside. That won't be necessary. The voices outside went silent. Daniel slowly opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the rifle resting calmly in his hands. 3 men stood in front of him. All of them were armed. The lantern light flickered across their surprised faces. One of them squinted at Daniel. Who the hell are you? Daniel leaned against the wooden post, completely calm. Funny thing, he said quietly. I was about to ask you the same question. The men exchanged confused looks. The tallest one stepped forward. We're deputies of Sheriff Wallace, he said proudly. Daniel nodded slowly. And what brings Wallace's men onto my land in the middle of the night? The deputies laughed. Your land, one of them mocked. This property belongs to Sheriff Wallace now. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Does it? The tall deputy narrowed his eyes. Who are you? Daniel took a slow step forward. My name is Daniel Carter. The words hit the men like thunder. For a moment, none of them moved. One of the deputies suddenly laughed nervously. That's funny. Why? Daniel asked. Because Daniel Carter died in the war. Daniel's expression didn't change. Well, he said calmly, looks like someone forgot to tell me. The three deputies stared at him in shock. The tall man shook his head. You expect us to believe that? Daniel shrugged. You don't have to believe anything. But tomorrow morning, the entire town will know. The men looked uneasy now. If Daniel Carter really was alive, everything Sheriff Wallace claimed about the land could fall apart. The tall deputy tried to sound confident again. You should leave town, stranger, he said coldly. This land isn't yours anymore. Daniel's eyes hardened. My father built this place with his own hands. He tapped the wooden post beside him. I was born inside that cabin. The wind blew across the porch, making the lantern sway. And I fought 4 years in a war believing I'd come back to it, Daniel continued quietly. His voice grew colder. So no, I'm not leaving. The deputies glanced at each other. This situation wasn't going the way they expected. Finally, the tall one spat on the ground. Suit yourself. He pointed a finger at Daniel. But tomorrow, the sheriff will deal with you. Daniel gave a small smile. I was hoping he would. The men mounted their horses. Before riding away, one of them looked back toward the cabin. His eyes landed on Abigail standing in the doorway. Well, look at that, he said with a grin. The runaway girl is still here. Abigail stiffened. Daniel noticed immediately. You know her? He asked sharply. The deputy chuckled. Oh yeah. He looked at Abigail like she was something he owned. Sheriff Wallace has been looking for you. Daniel stepped down from the porch slowly. And why would that be? The man shrugged. Let's just say, she owes him something. Abigail's hands trembled slightly. Daniel's voice dropped dangerously low. She doesn't owe him anything. The deputy laughed again. You might want to ask her about that. Then the three men rode off into the darkness. Their hoofbeats slowly faded into the night. The silence afterward felt heavy. Daniel turned toward Abigail. Her face was pale again. What did he mean? Daniel asked quietly. She didn't answer. Abigail. She looked up slowly. There was fear in her eyes. Before I came here, she said softly, I passed through Sonora. Daniel listened carefully. I needed food, she continued. So I went to the general store. And, Abigail swallowed. Sheriff Wallace was there. Daniel already didn't like where this story was going. He offered to help me, she said. Daniel frowned. Help how? He said I could work for him. Something about the way she said that made Daniel's stomach twist. What kind of work? Abigail's voice dropped to a whisper. I don't think it was honest work. Daniel's jaw tightened. So you refused? She nodded. Yes. And then, he told me I owed him money for the supplies I took. Daniel sighed. And you didn't have it? No. Abigail looked down at her shaking hands. He said I could pay him another way. Daniel felt anger boiling inside him. What did you do? I ran, she said simply. Daniel leaned back against the porch railing. So Wallace wants you found? Yes. And now his men know where you are. Abigail nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel looked out toward the dark road again. Well, he said quietly. That complicates things. Abigail gave a sad smile. I'm sorry. Daniel shook his head. Don't be. He looked at the cabin, the land, the fields. The truth is, he said slowly, I was already planning to fight Sheriff Wallace. He glanced at her again. Now I just have 2 reasons. Abigail stared at him in surprise. 2. Daniel smiled slightly. 1 for my land. Then his expression grew serious again. And 1 for you. For the first time since arriving in Texas, Abigail Thompson felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But neither of them knew that by morning, Sheriff Wallace himself would be coming to the cabin. And when he arrived, everything would change. The sheriff arrives. The sun had barely begun to rise when Daniel Carter stepped outside the cabin. A thin layer of morning fog hung over the fields, and the land was quiet except for the distant chirping of birds. For a moment, Daniel simply stood there. This land had once been full of life. Clarice garden used to bloom near the fence. Horses used to run through the fields. And laughter used to echo from the cabin porch. Now everything felt different, but one thing was certain: he wasn't leaving again. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Abigail stepped outside, holding 2 cups of coffee she had somehow managed to make from supplies in Daniel's saddlebag. "Morning," she said softly. Daniel accepted the cup with a faint smile. "Morning." They stood quietly for a moment, watching the sunrise spread across the Texas plains. Then Abigail asked the question that had been weighing on her mind all night. "What are you going to do?" Daniel took a sip of the coffee. "First, I'm going into town." Abigail frowned. "To see Sheriff Wallace?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. That's dangerous." Daniel looked at her calmly. "Everything worth doing usually is." Just as Abigail was about to say something else, they heard it. Hoofbeats. Not just one horse. Several. Daniel slowly placed the coffee cup on the porch railing. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like town came to us instead." Abigail's eyes widened as 5 riders appeared on the dirt road leading to the cabin. At the front of them rode a large man with broad shoulders and a black coat. A silver badge glinted on his chest. Abigail whispered nervously, "That's him." Daniel already knew. Sheriff Wallace. The group stopped near the broken fence. Sheriff Wallace studied Daniel carefully from his horse. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "So," Wallace said slowly, "looks like the rumors were true." Daniel crossed his arms. "What rumors would that be?" "That a dead man walked back into my town." Daniel smiled slightly. "Seems have disappointed a lot of people by surviving." The deputies behind Wallace chuckled nervously. But the sheriff didn't laugh. He swung down from his horse and walked toward the porch. Each step felt deliberate, controlled, dangerous. He stopped a few feet from Daniel. "Daniel Carter," he said. Daniel nodded. "Sheriff Wallace." The 2 men stared at each other in silence. The tension in the air was thick. Finally, Wallace spoke again. "You should have stayed dead." Abigail gasped quietly. Daniel didn't react. "Funny thing about that," Daniel replied calmly. "I tried." One of the deputies snorted. Wallace's eyes moved toward Abigail. "Well, look who else we found," he said. Abigail instinctively stepped closer to Daniel. Wallace smiled coldly. "You've been causing me some trouble, girl." Daniel's voice dropped. "Leave her out of this." Wallace ignored him. "She owes me money," he continued. Abigail shook her head. "That's not true." Wallace laughed. "Of course it is." He looked back at Daniel. "She stole supplies from my town." Daniel tilted his head. "And you're the banker now." Wallace's smile faded slightly. "I'm the law." Daniel shrugged. "So you keep saying." The deputies shifted uncomfortably. This conversation wasn't going the way they expected. Wallace took another step forward. "You see, Daniel," he said slowly. "When the army reported you dead." Daniel waited. "Your wife sold this land." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "She couldn't." Wallace shrugged. "Seems she did." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Where are the papers?" Wallace's expression tightened. "In my office." Daniel nodded. "Good." Wallace looked confused. Why is that good? Daniel smiled. Because I'll be seeing them soon. Wallace laughed loudly. You think you're just going to walk into my office and demand things? Daniel didn't blink. No, I'm going to walk into town and remind everyone that you stole from a dead soldier. The deputies exchanged worried looks. Sheriff Wallace's smile disappeared. For the first time, real anger flashed in his eyes. You're making a mistake, Wallace warned. Daniel stepped closer. So did you. The two men were now only inches apart. Wallace lowered his voice. You have no idea how much power I have in this town. Daniel looked him straight in the eyes. I've faced cannons and cavalry charges. Then he spoke the words that made the deputies nervous. You don't scare me. Silence fell over the field. Finally, Wallace stepped back. He turned toward his horse. Well, he said coldly. I suppose we'll see what the town thinks about all this. He mounted his horse again. Before leaving, he looked at Abigail one last time. Run while you can, he said. Both of you. Then he turned his horse and rode away with his men. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Abigail let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. That man is dangerous, she whispered. Daniel nodded. Yes. Abigail looked at him. So what happens now? Daniel grabbed his hat and placed it firmly on his head. Now, he said calmly. We go to town. He glanced toward the road where Wallace had disappeared. And we find out the truth. Abigail stared at him for a moment. You really think the town will stand against him? Daniel's expression became serious. Maybe. He looked back at the land one more time. But even if they don't. His voice grew colder. I didn't survive the war just to let a crooked sheriff steal my life. Abigail suddenly realized something. Daniel Carter wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for justice. And soon, the entire town of Sonora would be forced to choose a side. The town that stood up to the sheriff. The road to town felt longer than usual. Daniel Carter rode slowly, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust along the dry path. Abigail rode beside him on the second horse Daniel had found in the old barn behind the cabin. Neither of them spoke much. The morning sun climbed higher over the Texas plains, casting long shadows behind them. Finally, the small town of Sonora appeared in the distance. Daniel felt a strange feeling in his chest. This town had once been his home. Now it felt like unfamiliar territory. As they rode into the main street, people began noticing them. A few men standing outside the general store froze. A woman carrying a basket stopped walking. Someone whispered loudly, "Is that Daniel Carter?" Within seconds, more people stepped outside their shops. Shock spread across their faces. One old man slowly walked closer. "Daniel?" he asked carefully. Daniel nodded. "It's me, Mr. Jenkins." The old man stared at him like he had seen a ghost. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "He's alive." The word spread quickly through the street. "He's alive. Daniel Carter's alive." Windows opened. Doors creaked. Soon a small crowd had gathered. People who had once been Daniel's neighbors. People who had attended his funeral. People who had believed he was gone forever. Then someone pushed through the crowd. A familiar voice called out his name. "Daniel." Daniel turned. Standing near the post office was Clara, his wife. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. Clara looked different. Her hair was shorter. Her face carried the quiet sadness of someone who had spent years grieving. But it was still her. Her hands trembled as she walked closer. "Is it really you?" she whispered. Daniel stepped down from his horse. "Yes." Clara suddenly began crying. "I thought you were dead." Daniel's voice softened. I almost was. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Clara stepped forward and hugged him tightly. The crowd watched silently. Even Abigail felt tears forming in her eyes. After a long moment, Clara pulled back. I waited, she said. I waited almost a year. Daniel nodded. I know. But the army letter said you were gone. Daniel looked down. They made a mistake. Clara wiped her tears. I never wanted to leave the cabin. Daniel frowned. But Abigail said you sold the land. Clara looked confused. Sold it? Yes. She shook her head immediately. No, I never sold anything. The crowd began murmuring. Daniel's expression darkened. Then someone forged the papers. Clara nodded slowly. I think I know who. At that exact moment, a voice echoed across the street. Well, well, what a touching reunion. Everyone turned. Sheriff Wallace stood outside his office. His deputies stood behind him. His expression was cold. So the dead soldier finally came home. Daniel stepped forward. You forged the land papers. Wallace shrugged. You can't prove that. Clara suddenly spoke up. I can. Everyone looked at her. She pointed toward Wallace. He forced me to sign something when I was leaving town. Wallace's smile faded slightly. You were grieving, he said. You probably don't remember correctly. But another voice suddenly joined in. She remembers just fine. The crowd parted. An older man stepped forward. It was Mr. Jenkins. I was there that day, he said firmly. More townspeople began speaking. He did the same thing to my sister. And my cousin. He took our land too. The murmuring grew louder. Sheriff Wallace realized something dangerous was happening. The town was turning against him. He reached for his gun. But before he could pull it out, Daniel Carter was faster. Daniel's revolver was already pointed straight at him. The street went silent. Don't, Daniel said calmly. Wallace froze. You think pointing a gun will scare me? Wallace growled. Daniel's voice stayed steady. No, but the truth might. He looked around at the crowd. This man stole from widows. He pointed toward the sheriff. He took land from families who lost everything in the war. More angry voices rose from the crowd. Wallace glanced around nervously. For the first time in years, he wasn't the most powerful man in the room anymore. Then Mr. Jenkins stepped forward again. We're done being afraid of you. Another man added, you're not the law anymore. Someone else shouted, take off the badge. The crowd began closing in. Wallace looked at his deputies. But even they looked uncertain now. One of them slowly removed his badge. I'm done with this, the deputy muttered. Another followed. Wallace's power was collapsing right in front of him. Finally, he dropped his gun. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. The town had made its choice. Hours later, Wallace sat locked inside the small jail he had controlled for years. This time, he was the prisoner. The town council gathered to decide his punishment. But outside, life slowly returned to normal. Daniel stood near the old water well. Abigail walked over to him. You did it, she said. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked at the people around the street. The town did. Abigail smiled softly. You gave them courage. Daniel looked toward Clara talking with some neighbors. A complicated feeling crossed his face. Abigail noticed. What will you do now? She asked. Daniel looked toward the distant hills. First, I rebuild the cabin. He smiled slightly. Then I rebuild my life. Abigail nodded. That sounds like a good plan. Daniel looked at her. You're welcome to stay. Abigail looked surprised. Really? Daniel shrugged. This land is big enough. For the first time in a long time. Abigail laughed. Then I guess I'm not leaving. The wind moved gently across the Texas plains. The same land that once felt empty now felt full of possibility. Daniel Carter had returned from the war expecting to find nothing. Instead, he found justice, a new beginning, and the courage of a town that finally stood together. And sometimes, that's the kind of ending worth fighting for. Please friends spot my channel, subscribe, comment, like, share. Thanks for watching.